So, hi everyone. I'm here today with Alan Nagel. He's the CEO and founder of KYP. So, Alan, you just explained to me sort of what KYP stands for. Is it know your partner?
Yeah, we use it in a couple of contexts. It means know your partner, know your provider. When I looked into the market and I looked into transaction monitoring and business monitoring, there's tools in transaction monitoring that being used for the last 20 years, like IP address, risk scoring, behavioral biometrics, device ID, etc. And in the business world, a lot used in onboarding and risk. And I thought there's a big gap in the market using tools in transaction monitoring to monitor businesses, open banking, and all third-party monitoring becoming big in the scene and risk in the FCA. I thought it'd be a good place to start to look at businesses, profile them differently, and connect data globally that's not currently connected. So I created KWP 3 or 4 years ago, and it seems to be going well.
We sort of came across each other, I suppose. Just, we've had the DORA Act and the Operation Resilience Act in the UK come out, and this FCA requirement around understanding what your supply chain is and those kind of things, and sort of like particularly like what your supplier is, and you've got end responsibility for that. I mean, have you sort of seen that grow over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, as you say, you sort of like set up? I mean, it must be getting more popular and more scrutiny around it.
Yeah, certainly. If you look at examples in the newspaper, particularly, and sanctions with Russian oil and stuff like that, they're hiring fourth-party boats and third-party boats to travel their oil across the countries and across the world, even though they're sanctioned. So a lot of focus is paid attention by the government, paid by businesses, and who you're connected and who your partner is connected to. We were talking to a government agency that were in fear of where were they getting their raw materials from, because the last thing they wanted to appear was in the front of the Daily Mail. So there's definitely more consideration about who you're dealing with, how you onboard your third parties and fourth parties, and what disclosures you need, especially with the nature in which businesses work. It seems that some part of the business onboards the company, and then another part of the business monitors the company, and then there's a review a year later. Business is like a person. Every day change. You could be, the CEO could be Alan Nagel, and then it could change to Vladimir Putin. Unless you do a review and continuously monitor them, or you're not aware of these risks, they're not updated in real time, and how you're meant to enforce your obligations in terms of the FCA and guidelines, and how you're meant to enforce your financial obligations globally, unless you continue to monitor businesses. So certainly in the last 3 to 4 years, have we seen a shift? And I think it's particularly down to businesses and how quickly they move. If you look at people and businesses over the last 100 years, they'd walk into a bank and say, Chris knows me, can I get a loan at the bank? And the bank manager say, okay, Chris, I dealt with you, you voucher him. Then it turned into credit scoring, where people went in and got their credit scored based on data that is available. Now all over the world, businesses have data in India, China, Pakistan, different directors globally, and the world has become a smaller place. You can import from different companies, and you create your own IP to understand real business risk and third and fourth party monitoring. And this information isn't available in one single source of truth. It's all siloed. So one part of the business might have one piece of information, while another part might have another information. So the risk is growing every day in terms of monitoring these businesses, siloed information, and not being able to understand real business risk and understand the gaps in the market.
Yeah. I mean, how much of a problem do you think that's sort of been? I mean, particularly post pandemic and COVID, where we did an awful lot of outsourcing, right? And then it's not just the outsourcers, it's the people you outsource to, they then outsource to people. So you have this almost like this chain effect, don't you, of different like suppliers going all the way through. And at the end of the day, the owner of the customer is still responsible for that entire chain. I mean, how much do you think it's accelerated as a result of that? Because we're almost like we're building ecosystems of outsourcers, even if we only outsource to one people. It's suppliers on suppliers on suppliers. I mean, do you sort of see that stuff coming across?
Yeah, if you look at when we onboarded with a tier one company in the UK, we were asked to supply our third party and fourth party contractors and who we're dealing with globally. And if we changed them key subcontractors or dependencies, we'd have to report that to the company you're working with, and they could review us through their TPRM system. So even with us as a small business, we have to be very aware who we're onboarding, who we're doing business with. And then when we're dealing with tier one institution, it's very likely that they'll want to continuously monitor and continuously update them as part of our contract. And obviously that comes with loads of risk for them and loads of like manuals work for us. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep on top of the new regulations, especially as a small business. Was a large business, it must be a nightmare to keep on top of them third parties and fourth parties, because you don't really know where raw materials are coming from. You don't really know where the information, the hardware, who actually owns them, We've seen TikTok in the USA being scrutinized, Huawei and BAE Systems recently, they bought printers who had firmware installed in them that were built by the Chinese government. So defense contractors are printing out information that's being sent back to the Chinese government in real time. So how do you know who you're actually buying from and how are they businesses set up in order to cover their tracks? So it's very difficult to monitor all them.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what are some of the complexities you have around sort of like doing all that monitoring? I mean, you talked a bit about finance, you talked a bit about directors of companies, talked a bit about sourcing where hardware or raw materials might come from. What are some of the complexities that you sort of see within your kind of monitoring environment?
Well, the way we see it is that because businesses are so complex and big these days, and so many risk elements like cybersecurity risks, there's dark web risks, there's ransomware risks, who the stakeholders are, who the business is, who the ultimate beneficial owners are, where the source of funds come from. And as the world is changing and sanctions are increasing, with Russia, Ukraine, China having different sanctions in each different country, depending on where you are in the world, you could be a global organization like Google, and you'll have, if you're operating now in the US, you'll have sanctions on one country. And when you're operating now in Australia, you may have sanctions on 2 or 3 other countries. So it's very hard to keep on top of all them risks. And particularly if like a business you on board, you start your partnership with, they're based in the UK, and then all of a sudden you move to Russia. You on board them, you expect them to be a UK company. A year later, you check in, they've moved to Russia 9 months ago, and you're liable then for a fine because you're not adhering to your policies and guidelines. And the only way to do that, instead of siloed approach to monitoring or a static approach to monitoring, is continuously monitoring businesses through holistic data globally. What's the pertinent information you need to know to stick to your policies to make sure you adhere to your guidelines or your policies? And if we need to make sure this company is selling out the UK, then if they change country, you need to be notified of that straight away. So how do you put the alerting system in place to make sure that you're on top of that and preemptive about these attacks? Because you can't be all over everything, but you have to make sure that whatever the top 10 or 15 things most risky aspects are about partnering with a company, you have to be monitoring them in real time.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you can have like a review process. It might be an annual review process. I mean, is that frequent enough, or is it a monthly review process? Or then you're almost like getting down to that's almost like real time alerts, isn't it? So it's like, so you've got a risk and it's a real time alert to say, look, this is a flag that's happened.
So that's the beauty about KYP is that my idea is that instead of having false positives or stock reviews, what I used to do in the past was once a year, we'd say, you need to review this company, review them, and then check the boxes. In the real world, that doesn't happen. It gets put to the bottom of the pile. And what KYP do is like we check on a daily basis, credit score, risk score, stakeholders, etc. And we only alert the company when something change or risk change. But then we have audit logs about what we checked, what we done. We check the credit score according to the policies. And then when a regulatory body comes in and says, have you done the checks you said you do according to your policies? They show them the audit logs, they show them the risks, and we only send them alerts when there's an issue. So instead of checking according to your SOC policies, oh, we tick that box, you're only really checking when there's a risk. And that's the key thing about how you do continuous monitoring and how the world has changed.
Yeah. Now, I know you've got a background in risk as well. We were just chatting before of risk and fraud. I mean, and you sort of have these sort of macro indicators. So it might be the company's address has changed from one to the other, or the directors have changed. But then you probably also have these like smaller indicators that could be indicative of something actually going on more fundamentally. So something in the accounts or those kind of things. I mean, what are almost like these micro indicators to look out for that might be flagging a potential risk? I mean, do you see some of those? It's like, well, look, this piece is something's changed here in the invoicing or in the accounts. That might indicate that it needs a little bit more scrutiny. Do you see some of that?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways you could do it. Like in the FCA or the financial regulatory body, when you sign up to brand guidelines or Visa card board guidelines, what tends to happen is someone puts on the face for like 2 years, sells stocks. They said they're going to sell 1,000 stocks a month. It's going to be £10 per stock, 10 grand per month. And they behave like that for about 1 or 2 years, increasing their volume slowly and slightly and slightly. And then on the Friday night at about 5 o'clock, he starts selling laptops and withdrawing the funds really quickly. So that behavior will signify a change in behavior, or they may change. What we do quite sneakily is that we look at SEO traffic and where the website traffic is going to and bin numbers and change your volumetrics or change your payments behavior. So if someone goes from selling socks in the UK, all of a sudden most of their payments come through bins in Turkey and the volumetrics all change and the website activity is below the number of transactions, you can use all these risk indicators to say that the business risk has changed and the overall profile of the business has changed. You can look at addresses. So there's tools like Etigate out there. You look at phone numbers and they risk score phone numbers. So my problem statement with the business world is it hasn't caught up with the transaction monitoring. So FeedSci, Featurespace, and Xeon will have tools in place where you look at their IP, you look at their phone number, you look at their address, you look at their device ID, behavioral biometrics, and you gather all these soft links and you can link one transaction to another and shut it down straight away in real time. But in businesses, you can create Ann the Builder. You can take a company for 2 to 5 million and then create Bob the Builder under similar details, and they're not linked together through a graph database. And I don't think business monitoring has caught up to the extent where you're linking companies who are high risk together through these sophisticated tools. And I think we're a long way away from transaction monitoring where we should have been 10 years ago, business monitoring.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I think it's interesting how everything kind of links together. You're talking about just graph databases there, and sort of like how you do that on a because you can do that on a consumer point of view, can't you? In terms of like how these things basically link together. I mean, how fast do you think that the business world is sort of catching up with some of those things? I mean, I know there's been changes in like companies' house registration details that's been coming through. I mean, it feels like they're trying to tighten that, but it sounds from what you're saying is the outside world where there's nefarious activities moving even faster than we might actually know about to a certain extent. I mean, what's your kind of perspective on that?
Well, like, you think that it's a good step for the government to have controls around companies' house and globally having access to company information. But as far as I could see, fraudsters are miles ahead of the game in terms of the tools they're using. If I'm a fraudster now, I'm going to be using AI to hack any system. I'm going to look at any ports that are open. I'm going to be looking at any businesses. I'm going to create, instead of creating a fraud or a FeedSci or a Xeon, I'm going to be creating the fraudster AI platform that can hack any system and that can do it instantaneously. So there's no controls there. We've heard recently in the news about one person in the company transferred 20 million to a bank account via a Teams call because all the managers were on the call, their voices were recorded, and they persuaded this secretary to transfer 25 million over a Teams call that looked like it was real and genuine. So fraudsters are miles ahead of the curve in terms of the systems they're using, the AI they're using, and they're all innovative. So they're like small startups. They can move really quickly. They can change. But our adaptation towards them rules is miles behind, especially in larger organizations.
Yeah, I mean, how do we as organizations sort of like stay ahead of some of that, or at least go some way to kind of catch up? We talked a little bit about real-time updates there, but are there pieces of information we're not looking at that we've got to start thinking about? You talked about graph databases as well.
I think that the conferences are good, but if I'm a fraudster, I'm going to be attending them conferences, listen to the keynote speakers, listen to what they're saying their tactics are, stop fraudsters, and then avoiding them applications to bypass them, because you have to be thinking that there's not only fraud experts and credit experts attending these events, there's going to be fraudsters there, listen to what experts are saying, and then find out the ways they can bypass them and be better than them. So we're in the open, they're in closed loop networks, and we're not aware what they're doing, but they're well aware what we're doing because it's all in the market, it's all open. And a lot of the data that if a bank is hacked or something does happen, how many of them are actually released, or how many of them just paid a ransomware? How often are you looking on the dark web? One example I have is this guy, the CEO, wanted to put a fish tank in his office. And the guy who installed the fish tank installed a temperature monitoring device that he could connect to from home. Because he installed that, didn't have closed ports or secure passwords, the company got hacked and got taken for 50 million in ransomware. So even hiring someone to install a fish tank who's too lazy to go into the office to the temperature can be a risk. And how do you put in controls and securities and onboarding in place to stop something like that? It's nearly impossible. But fraudsters are going on, scanning a building, looking at all the open ports, and then connecting through and seeing what access they can get through the back ends.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I was at a conference the other day as well, and we were talking about also the human engineering side of it as well. So you're talking about AI there on Teams calls, and sort of the fact that we want to be nice to people and getting entry to buildings and sort of like giving stuff away, that social engineering side of things as well. I mean, how much are we open to that, and how much of that do you think we can kind of detect and prevent with things like technology? Is it all around processes and procedures and sort of making sure we've got layers of protections to try and catch some of these things? The bar's rising.
Well, like, I was taught by an extremely smart guy, Lauren Chang, who used to report directly to Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook. And fraudsters change across the world, and you'll have one scam in Lithuania and you'll see a split scam here, or you'll have one scam in England and one scam in France. But the thing that you're meant to do in terms of stopping fraud is create barriers. So like maybe over £500 per transaction, over 1,000, over 2,000, and set limits instead of like a whack-a-mole when the thing pops up. You stop fraud at this level, you stop fraud at that level. And every risk framework you put in place has to be thought of in a global perspective and not just individual responses to fraud. You have to really think about how to continuously understand risk and exposure and what could happen, and make sure when you hit 1, 2, 3 fraud alerts, they really fraud alerts, and how to react to them rather than individual cases or unique cases, because that doesn't work. Because once you stop one, you just change another and change another. So it's very hard. You have to be very consistent in layers of understanding and blockers all over the place. And then automated shutdowns. Our rule was if the hit rate of a fraud queue was less than 20%, it wasn't good enough. It was over 40%, we'd shut them down straight away. So the risk scoring has to be AI, has to be agentic, has to make sure it's connecting data from multiple sources, and has to understand when a fraud is taking place as quickly as possible. And that's going to be the future of technology as well.
Yeah, I mean, things are moving very fast. And in terms of industry focus, and I know you work across a lot of industries, not just financial services, you look at other industries, really across the whole gamut. I mean, do you see are there some sectors in the market that are sort of more suspect or more sort of attracted to fraudsters than others, or to supply risks than others? I mean, there must be some that are definitely, I mean, defense is one, and we one that's definitely very careful. Financial services has got quite large ticket items, if you can look at them. I mean, are there areas that you think are sort of like have particular areas of focus that are greater risk and need to have different kind of tactics?
Well, like, I think the obvious one at the moment is AI. Everybody's trying to steal that information globally. Defenses are another. For us in particular, we're looking at open banking, because every time a new payment system gets released to the network, fraudsters think, how can I exploit this as quickly as possible? So like, if you think about banks, they have to open up their APIs. Third-party providers can connect to them with APIs, and banks have no control over that. If you're a TPP, you connect to a bank's API instantaneously. It costs you about 50 to 100 grand to set them up, and then you can make payments and information requests. If they're hacked or they're set up for nefarious activity, what's the exposure of the bank like? And I think emerging technologies like this is where, if I was a fraudster, I'd be thinking, how can I expose that? How can I make money out of that? And how much will it cost? So I think they're key areas of our risk in the future.
I mean, Alan, very much you're talking about almost like a completely new world in terms of the speed and velocity of change and what's being looked at sort of in the background and sort of like the outside kind of world. What's your reaction, I suppose, when you go into particularly some of the larger companies who might have been around for 100 years or even more? I mean, what's your reaction when you start talking about this with people who are used to the process? Are people ready for it, or how far away are we from understanding and being up to speed with this?
I think people understand it. It's getting buy-in from the leadership team. You could have a company with, say, 15, 20 million people in it. In order to get buy-in, understanding, sign-off, that may take 6 to 12 months. The time you get stakeholders on board, you get onboarded, could be another 12 months. And then decide, okay, we need to implement this technology. And the stakeholder you originally agreed to get the project on board with, the CTO, the person in charge of project change, two of them could leave the business, and then you're starting from scratch again. So the problem with big organizations is the speed in which they make them changes, make them agreements, and the processes they put in place and the barriers they put in place to innovation. Innovation happens externally and gets bought by big companies. But in order to implement that from an external point of view, it takes so much of the company coming together, the length of time it takes to get them on board. And once you get stakeholder buy-in, which happened to us with a couple of companies, 3 or 4 of them can leave, and then you're back to square one where you need stakeholders. So it's very difficult to get change in any big organization, and the layers of bureaucracy just take too long.
I mean, the big thing there is trying to stay ahead of it, right? Because then if you have some sort of breach or something happens, then you're on the back foot, right? I mean, the difficult piece is trying to persuade people that they need preventative type of technology before something happens, not after it happens. Right, because I mean, otherwise it costs you a lot of money. I mean, that seems like the never-ending kind of challenge for a lot of us. I mean, it's a credit risk kind of problem as well.
So I'll give you an example. I won't name the company, but the company worth about 50 billion. It was an insurance company. We put them through our system. We showed them they got a hack about a month ago, and the chief risk officer was named on the hack. And their web app security was an E or a D, and the CEO asked him what the hell is going on here, and he didn't know anything about it. Do you
Yeah.
think he bought the system? No, but they were all shocked that they were hacked, but there was no action to put any preventive measures in place, because they say, okay, we're really interested in buying this system. It takes them 6 months to get the budget signed off. Then they come in, and then the integration takes place. And the time that happens, the fraudsters have moved on, and they say, oh, we don't want the system. But it's a clear case of there where proactive action is required, but bureaucracy takes precedence. So how hard is it to get people moving? Very difficult. And people don't want to pay for compliance. People don't want to pay for risk. Only after you lose, like the SolarWinds hack in the USA, where the company lost $4 billion, do you want to pay for this compliance and security? But you don't want to put that in place until the major fraud takes place. And then they say, okay, we can put the budget towards that now, because companies are interested in making money, not in hiring 100 compliance analysts.
I mean, there's been a few fines even this month, right? I mean, particularly from the FCA around financial crime reviews. I mean, that surely must help in terms of like sharpening the mind a little bit in terms of like, we've got to have some of these things. I mean, albeit that's probably more from there's risk to the consumer there, which is where they're coming from. But I suppose it comes down to sort of systemic risk and potentially supplier risk as well.
Yeah, with the fines coming through, that certainly helps. Like we sometimes just feel like we're ambulance chasers, when something goes wrong, people go, oh, we must look at this. But the spotlight is definitely on it when the FCA or the iGaming Commission finds a company for illegal practices or not doing what they said they'd do. The way I look at it is that the FCA have guidelines and the iGaming Commission have guidelines. You implement your policies. You say, this is what we're going to do. You pass a test, and then you go off and do your business and forget about the compliance. And then when the FCA or MasterCard or Visa walks around and says, did you do what you said you were going to do? Companies go, oops. And then the gaps in areas. Where's the Excel spreadsheet? Where's your evidence-based approach? Where's your training? When you're starting off, it's like, we need to make money. Like Revolut, they went off, they exploded, and the compliance didn't necessarily keep up with the level of expansion they had. So it's like difficult to manage where you want to make money compared to one of the famous sayings we had in PayPal. You put brakes in the Formula One car to make it go faster, not slower. So that's when you're talking to people about risk and compliance, that's one of the terms I use.
So I like that saying. I do like that. I mean, we talked a lot about fraud, I suppose, and hacking and security and those kind of things. But I suppose the other piece with the supplier infrastructure is also financial resilience as well. So like looking through accounts and making sure that, particularly if you've got a single supplier and you have a single supplier because they're giving you the best price, but if they then go bust, then you can then be at risk from that. I mean, that surely must be another kind of like big angle there. I mean, I'm not sure how often you see that. And in the back of my mind, I've got, well, we might go into an economic downturn. There was cost-cutting measures was in the headlines today. I mean, how much of a risk do you think that is?
Well, one of my previous employees worked for a company, and their checkout every year was to look at company's house to see if the company was still active or not active. And they were a supplier to them, and he signed a contract worth 50 million in IT services. And 2 weeks later, they went out of business. They got the money and then went out of business for bankruptcy, and there's no recourse. And the CEO was like, what checks do we have and balance do we have when we're doing this? We check whether we're active in company's house. That's not enough anymore. You have to do continuous credit checks. You have to continue to look at the directors. You have to continue to understand the financial liability of a company. And if you're doing basic checks like that, how much risk do you have putting the company, particularly when it's such a large amount of money,
It's a hugely and very quickly evolving world. I mean, where do you sort of see it sort of like evolving from here? I mean, you talked about the speed that's kind of happening. I mean, what are some of the new risks we've got to look out for? Where do you think it'll evolve from here in the next 2 or 3 years? What do we got to really look out for?
Well, I think that with AI is particularly going to be key. Virtual videos, virtual hacking, voiceover software where I can pretend to be Chris Warburton 1 second, and that's a huge risk going forward, because it's not only social engineering anymore where you go in and pretend to be someone. You can actually sound like someone's boss and say, I need this done now. And with someone that's really good at pretending to be that guy, can put the fear of God into a secretary or someone who's in control of the bank or someone who's in control of payments. By social engineering correctly now and being able to put your voice and your face on a video and say, get that done now. You're not only dealing with a person, you're dealing with fear, you're dealing with, I want to keep my job. You're dealing with, I have to do what the boss says, it's me. And imagine the stress that puts on their employees. And how do you train someone to do that? I think Malcolm Gladwell speaks about this in one of his books about flight engineers and captains and how to respond to people in flight school. So there's one example of this Asian aircraft was flying around New York, and the tower said, just do another lap around. We were running out of petrol. And the Asian culture was very subservient. And he said, yes, we're running out of petrol, just do another lap. And the plane crashed with 250 people on board. And there was a big investigation why this happened. And the result was that Asians are subservient and don't question people. And then there was an Irish pilot in the same situation. And he was basically, F you, I'm landing the plane on top of you if you don't let us land now because we're running out of fuel. And he was like, okay, clear all the runways. And it's now given in pilot training school and how to deal with situations of emergency like that. So how do you train the thinking of compliance and risk and social engineering to question their boss, to question these situations, to question 25 million being sent out? And how do you put this into a framework that people understand and be comfortable in questioning their bosses? And I think that's a way to move forward as well, because it took a long time for aircrafts to do that, but that was risks of lives. Now it's risks of people sending out money. So it's all about training, understanding, and questioning.
I mean, we've sort of been in this digital world where everything's been about doing things faster. How do you take elements out of the process? How do you do it electronically and those kind of things? Do you think we'll ever go back to sort of like, well, I want to see a wet signature as an example. I want to see in person before I actually have, particularly for big deals. I mean, it feels like it might evolve back to some of that I mean, at least it'll be prudent to do it for some of those things.
I've heard of a deal of a company being sold for like 1.5 billion. The deal was done in a McDonald's in Gibraltar, where the two CEOs sit down and done it without any flavor around them. So if something wants to happen, it'll happen fast. When Mark Zuckerberg bought Instagram, it was like there's £500 million bid put on the table. He bought it over a weekend and done his due diligence with the CEO and signed the contract on a Monday. So there is them face-to-face conversations going on, and when people are serious. But will it be face-to-face in the future? No, I do everything via DocuSign these days.
Yeah.
I try to do VC calls. Everybody wants to work remotely. How do you verify that someone's an engineer or compliance analyst doesn't have 2 or 3 jobs? You can't. But I guess tools and systems and products going to be in place to make sure that people are working the right hours, like mouse monitoring and stuff like that. The world is evolving, the world is changing, and the speed in which technology is changing. But I think the humans have caught up with it.
I'll just be relieved if there's an excuse for me to go and sit down and have a McDonald's with someone. It's probably the underlying piece for that. Well, Alan, thanks very much for a brief insight into your world in terms of what's happening in that supplier resilience space and the whole security space, because it's fascinating when it's coming up with the regulators starting to look at it, looking at the supply chain risks. And, clearly we've got to sort of start to think about it, because I'm not sure how much it's on people's radar. I mean, the regulators putting it on people's radar, but it sounds like it's evolving even quicker than probably a lot of us already know, I think. So.
Well, like if you look at the regulators, like they always keep back the timeline in which they're going to implement this security, and the time they do implement it, the next wave of technology is going to be coming quicker. I think Moore's law technology speed increases double per year. So what's going to be the next AI? What's going to be the next search engine? What's going to be the next risk? And how do you monitor them? And the time we implement this, there's going to be something else to do. And it's very hard for compliance, governments, people, and process to keep up with that, especially for a large organization. I guess that's what happens. But the good thing for startups and innovative people is they create technologies that can solve these problems. And even though they're going to lose jobs to AI and stuff like that, innovation is going to be around to protect organizations against the future of that technology. So there's always going to be jobs in that market to protect against the risks of the speed of growth of technology. So I find that part really interesting. And I always wonder what the next wave of innovation is going to be and how to be ahead of that curve.
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic. Alan, thanks very much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. It was good to chat to you.
Thanks.